For more than half a century, a single name was synonymous with mystery, power, and silence. A man who built the longest-lasting criminal empire in Latin America without spending a single day behind bars. A ghost who never gave interviews, was rarely photographed, and yet moved the drug routes as if playing a chessboard. While other drug lords bathed in luxury, songs, and headlines, he chose invisibility. That was his greatest strength, and also his curse. Today, the story of the man who never fell reaches its end. This is the rise and fall of Ismael Mayo Zambada Garcia, the man everyone knows as El Mayo. He was born on the 1st of January 1948, although some records point to 1,950 inches. El Álamo, a small rural community lost among the hills of Culiacán, Sinaloa. There, poverty was not a phase, it was an inheritance. Young Ismael grew up plowing the land with his own hands, planting corn and beans in soil that barely allowed survival. He lost his father at 12, and from then on, childhood became a luxury he couldn't afford. Each dawn was the same: the sun, the earth, and necessity. To help at home, he did everything: carried sacks, tended animals, and according to those who knew him, washed cars in the city for a few coins. There was no glorious destiny, only survival. But northern Mexico, in the 1,960 seconds, was no ordinary place. In those arid mountains, a business was beginning to take shape that would forever change the country's history. Drug trafficking. And that quiet-eyed young man was about to cross the border between poverty and power. The turning point came through blood. His sister married Antonio El Nico Cruz Vázquez, a Cuban trafficker with connections on both sides of the border. El Nico was his gateway into a world where cunning was worth more than weapons, and where silence was the most valuable currency of all. The Cuban Antonio El Nico Cruz Vázquez was more than a brother-in-law. He was his first mentor in the art of smuggling. From him, he learned 3 lessons that would define his destiny: how to move shipments without being seen, how to buy the silence of the right authorities, and how to understand that, in this business, luxury is the shortest path to the grave. When El Nico was imprisoned, Ismael didn't just inherit his contacts. He also kept his most important lesson: the need to disappear. From that moment on, El Mayo Zambada stopped being an anonymous farmer to become a silent strategist. Without firing a bullet or appearing in the headlines, he began to climb within the business. His name spread like a whisper among those who truly ruled. And in a world dominated by impulsive and power-hungry men, he understood that true control wasn't shouted, it was whispered. The lesson of silence. His brother-in-law's fate was the mirror where El Mayo saw everything he should avoid. El Nico, blinded by easy money, let himself be trapped by the lights of Las Vegas, by luxury cars, gambling, and endless parties. And in a universe where silence is the only form of survival, he chose noise. And noise, in drug trafficking, always ends the same way: in a cell or underground. El Mayo understood it instantly. Real power isn't measured in bodyguards or jewels, but in the ability to leave no trace. From then on, he swore to become invisible, to move through the shadows, to become a ghost no one could track. That choice would mark the birth of a legend. In the 1,970 seconds, young Zambada began to rise within Sinaloa's criminal underworld. His connections brought him closer to the most influential circles of drug trafficking. The Guadalajara Cartel, the organization that laid the foundations of modern crime in Mexico. At its head were 3 names that still resonate as myths: Miguel, Ángel, Félix, Gallardo, the boss of bosses; Rafael Caro Quintero, the narco of narcos; and Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, known as Don Neto. They weren't just smugglers. They were engineers of power. Under their command, the business stopped being artisanal and became a continental network. Routes from Colombia to the U.S. border. Both politicians, allied judges, and military officers on the payroll. The Guadalajara Cartel wasn't a gang. It was a system, a state within a state. And in the middle of that board, dominated by titans, the name of Ismael Zambada was barely a whisper. But it was a constant, patient whisper. And in the world of power, whispers always end up becoming orders. It wasn't his violence or ambition that made Ismael Zambada different, but his unusual ability to solve problems without raising his voice. While many measured their power in shootouts and mansions, he measured it in favors, loyalty, and silence. His style contrasted with that of his bosses. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, the so-called boss of bosses, was a political strategist, a diplomat of crime. At his side, Ernesto Don Neto Fonseca Carrillo represented the old school, respect, codes, and discretion. And Rafael Caro Quintero, the youngest and most reckless, became the visible face of the cartel. Caro loved excess. Cameras, parties, exotic cars, endless ranches. His fortune grew so fast that he began to think of himself as untouchable. But in drug trafficking, arrogance is an early sentence. Every time someone feels invincible, the clock of their downfall starts ticking. In the early 1980s, the Guadalajara Cartel reached its peak. They moved billions of dollars, influenced elections, and dictated rules that even politicians dared not break. It was an empire so vast it seemed eternal. But every organization that reaches the top ends up believing it can challenge everything, even the United States. And that arrogance would ignite the spark that triggered the largest drug manhunt in modern history, the Empire's Hunt. By 1985, the power of the Guadalajara Cartel seemed unbreakable. But that same year, a single mistake changed everything. A mistake that not only destroyed its leaders, but also forever altered the map of drug trafficking in Mexico. Driven by impunity and ego, Rafael Caro Quintero committed the worst of sins, directly challenging the United States. On the 7th of February 1985, DEA agents in Mexico reported the disappearance of one of their own. Hours later, the unthinkable was confirmed: the kidnapping of Enrique. Kiki Camarena, one of the agency's most respected agents, along with Alfredo Zavala Avelar, a Mexican civilian pilot who worked with him. For days, both men were brutally tortured. Their bodies were found weeks later on a rural road in Langostura, Michoacán. That crime shocked Washington and unleashed an unprecedented operation. Operation Legend, the largest manhunt ever undertaken by the DEA in its history. That crime was not just an execution. It was a declaration of war against the United States. The response was immediate and ruthless. Washington demanded justice, and the Mexican government, under unprecedented pressure, was forced to act. What followed was an unprecedented manhunt. Within months, the three pillars of the Guadalajara Cartel fell one after another. Rafael Caro Quintero, captured in Costa Rica in April 1985. Ernesto Don Neto Fonseca Carrillo, arrested a few weeks later in Puerto Vallarta. And finally, in 1989, the most influential of them all, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, the boss of bosses, arrested in Guadalajara during a federal operation. The blow was devastating. For the first time in a decade, Mexican drug trafficking was left without a central command. The monster had lost its head. With its founders behind bars, the empire collapsed. The routes, territories, and contacts shattered like a broken mirror. Each region became an autonomous fiefdom, and from those ruins would emerge the new drug lords. It was the beginning of a new era, one in which the kingpins no longer depended on a single organization, but on their own cunning, firepower, or their ability to become invisible. In the north, the Arellano Félix brothers imposed their law from Tijuana through kidnappings, blood, and terror. On the other side, Amado Carrillo Fuentes, the legendary Lord of the Skies, built an aerial empire, transporting tons of cocaine in fleets of private planes. The press spoke of nothing else. The new bosses were young, reckless, and ruthless. Each dreamed of being the next Felix Gallardo. Each believed himself invincible. But while they bled each other dry over control of the borders, in the mountains of Sinaloa, a quiet man charted his own path. Far from the spotlight, Ismael El Mayo Zambada observed the chaos with the calm of a strategist. He needed neither headlines nor luxury to prove his power. He knew that noise killed, and that in silence the most lasting empires are built. While others accumulated enemies, El Mayo gathered allies. While some signed their death sentence with violence, he perfected the art of disappearing. The fall of the Guadalajara Cartel had opened the gates of hell, but it had also offered Ismael Zambada the greatest opportunity of his life, to become something no one else could be. The ghost who would rule Mexico without being seen. The Pact of Shadows. By the mid-1992s, Mexican drug trafficking was going through a period of transition. The old bosses were dead, imprisoned, or in exile, and the criminal map of the country had turned into an open war among clans. Amid that chaos, one man moved undetected: El Mayo Zambada. His most lethal weapon was neither a rifle nor an army. It was his invisibility. In a business built on blood, betrayal, and greed, he knew that the secret to survival was to go unnoticed. While others sought headlines and ballads, he preferred to move in silence, letting others destroy each other. It was during that time that El Mayo crossed paths with another strategist of crime, a man who had taken the business to the skies, literally. Amado Carrillo Fuentes, a former pilot with a businessman's vision. Amado had turned the air into his personal domain. His fleet of private planes transported tons of cocaine from Colombia to Mexico with logistical precision that neither the DEA nor the Mexican army could trace. That's why they called him the Lord of the Skies. The encounter between them was not one of friendship, but of intelligence. They both knew that in this world, it wasn't about trust, but about convenience. El Mayo Zambada summed it up with a phrase he often repeated, according to his men. In this business, the enemy isn't the one who shoots, but the one who makes you do it. Their alliance was pragmatic, cold, perfectly calculated. El Mayo controlled production and territory. Amado dominated the air routes and international logistics. Together, they formed a network so precise it seemed designed by military engineers. Discretion, money, and total efficiency. For the first time, Mexican drug trafficking had something no government possessed: a strategy. For nearly a decade, the alliance between El Mayo Zambada and Amado Carrillo Fuentes redefined Mexican drug trafficking. No internal wars, no media stunts, only efficiency, strategic bribes, and tons of shipments crossing the continent as if they were invisible. They were two minds running an empire no army could touch. But in the world of drug trafficking, even the most perfect alliances have an expiration date. July 1997. A heavyset man discreetly entered the Sanatorio Santa Monica in the Polanco district of Mexico City. In the register, he appeared under a false name, Antonio Flores Montes. No one suspected that behind that alias was Amado Carrillo Fuentes, the most wanted drug trafficker in the country. Hounded by authorities and obsessed with escaping his own image, he made a desperate decision to undergo plastic surgery. He was seeking a new face, and with it, a new life. But at dawn, everything went wrong. Around 4 a.m. on July 5, the heart of the Lord of the Skies stopped. According to official reports, an overdose of the anesthetic dormicum and the inexperience of the medical team caused his death during the operation. The man who had ruled the skies died on an operating table, not by a bullet, nor by betrayal, but by ambition and fear. The news spread like wildfire. The death of Amado Carrillo unleashed a storm in the world of drug trafficking. His empire, which had operated with almost mathematical precision, was suddenly left without a leader. From Tijuana, the Arellano Felix brothers took advantage of the power vacuum to try to seize the most profitable routes in the country. In the north, other groups fought over the remnants of his aerial network. The sky, which for years had been the exclusive domain of the Lord of the Skies, was once again filled with fire, ambition, and betrayal. And while everyone fought over the spoils, El Mayo Zambada didn't lift a finger. He knew that desperate men destroy themselves. All he had to do was wait. Silence once again became his shield. And his strategy, as always, the smartest. To let others kill each other while he continued building his empire, the alliance of the century. After the death of Amado Carrillo Fuentes, Mexican organized crime became a board without rules. Every border was a battlefield, every alliance, a betrayal waiting for its turn. But while everyone bled for power, Ismael El Mayo Zambada did what he did best: wait, observe, and move unseen. His empire was not built through violence, but through corruption and strategy. In a country where institutions could be bought by the highest bidder, El Mayo discovered that a briefcase full of money opened more doors than an armed convoy. Throughout the 1,990 seconds, he wove a network of contacts so deep that it reached from municipal police to federal officials. He didn't need to shoot. Pain was enough. That method, silent, effective, invisible, became his personal signature. Meanwhile, hundreds of kilometers away, another man fought his own war, though from behind bars. Within the walls of Puente Grande prison, Joaquín Guzmán, Loera, known as El Chapo, refused to be controlled. He was the opposite of El Mayo, impulsive, charismatic, daring. While Zambada perfected the art of hiding, Guzmán dreamed of ruling the continent. And even from prison, he kept pulling the strings from his cell. He used messengers, bribes, and a network of contacts bought with money and fear. Nothing left or entered the prison without his knowledge. Between them was born something more than respect. An alliance was born that would forever change the history of drug trafficking. The combination was perfect. El Mayo brought discreción, intelligence, and structure. El Chapo, ambición, instinct, and boldness. Together, they created a formula impossible to match. One ruled silently from the mountains. The other challenged the state in broad daylight. By the late 1,990 seconds, Mexican authorities already knew that these two names operated together, but they couldn't yet grasp the magnitude of what they were building. On the 19th of January 2001, the Mexican prison system became the laughingstock of the world. El Chapo Guzmán had vanished from the Puente Grande prison, leaving behind the trail of an escape that proved, once again, that money and corruption were stronger than any wall. El Chapo Guzmán's escape was no stroke of luck. It was a surgical operation, meticulously planned and executed, with the complicity of corrupt officials and an army of collaborators infiltrated at every level. For weeks, the government tried to deny the obvious, but the facts were impossible to hide. The most wanted man in Mexico had escaped from a maximum security prison without firing a single shot. Free once more, El Chapo sealed a definitive alliance with Ismael El Mayo Zambada. And with an old hand in the trade, Juan José Esparragoza Moreno, El Azul. A low-profile veteran, diplomat, an expert at negotiating truces. From that moment on, the three formed the heart of the Sinaloa Cartel, an organization that ceased to be a regional group to become a continental power. While other cartels destroyed themselves in internal wars, El Mayo and El Chapo understood something no one else did. That real power was not imposed through fear, but through intelligence. They offered routes, protection, and money in exchange for loyalty. Enemies became partners. Rivals became allies. Thus, step by step, they built a criminal empire whose tentacles spread across the entire American continent. A force no government could control. A system so deeply infiltrated into the institutions that it became impossible to tell where crime ended and the state began. The invisible empire. The formula was as simple as it was deadly. Money, protection, and routes in exchange for loyalty. In a country where poverty and corruption walked hand in hand, that equation worked like a perfect mechanism. Thus was born the Zambada Guzmán Empire, a structure so precise it seemed designed by engineers, not by drug traffickers. Each piece had a specific function, and every gear answered to a single command center. El Mayo Zambada, the true logistical brain behind the business. While El Chapo became the public face of the cartel, El Mayo turned into its backbone, the man who kept everything running in silence. The Beltrán Leiva brothers became the cartel's first security ring. They controlled the land routes, air transport, and armed protection. They were the eyes, the guns, and the guardians of the empire. In Guadalajara, Ignacio Nacho Coronel built a chemical empire. He turned the city into the world capital of methamphetamine, an invisible capital of crystal. From there, tons of the product crossed every month into the United States, hidden among legal shipments of fruit, grain, and industrial goods. In Mexico City, Jesús el Rey, Zambada, brother of El Mayo, managed warehouses, laboratories, and distribution centers. He was the one who kept logistics balanced, ensuring the network operated with the precision of a multinational company. And at the highest level, the natural heir to the clan, Jesús Vicente Zambada Niebla, El Vicentillo, coordinated clandestine flights, contacts in South America, and direct negotiations with emissaries from the Colombian cartels. The structure of the Sinaloa Cartel no longer resembled a traditional criminal organization. It was a multinational of crime, a machine in which every gear had a specific function. Some produced, others transported, others laundered money, and all answered to the same leadership. At the top, El Chapo Guzmán set the visible rhythm, while El Mayo Zambada ensured the machinery never stopped. El Mayo's genius didn't lie in violence, but in his business vision. He understood that relying on a single drug or a single route was suicide. That's why he diversified the business like no one before him. From Colombia, he received cocaine. From the fields of Sinaloa, marijuana, and heroin. And when the rest of the world still ignored its destructive power, El Mayo bet on a new substance, fentanyl. He bought chemical precursors directly from Chinese suppliers, and built laboratories in northern Mexico, where a single kilo of that powder could multiply by 100 the value of any other drug. It was the future of the business, and he understood it before anyone else. In the air, a fleet of private planes crossed the skies under the radar, changing registrations, routes, and pilots with surgical precision. And on land, double-bottom trailers, cars with hidden compartments, and even entire trains were adapted to move tons of merchandise without leaving a trace. Each shipment was a calculated operation. Each bribe, an investment. The Sinaloa Cartel was no longer just a criminal group. It was a global network, with presence and contacts on 5 continents. And at the heart of that network, hidden in the shadows, remained Ismael, El Mayo, Zambada, the man who had learned to rule an empire without ever showing his face, the man who never existed. The Sinaloa Cartel had become a perfect machine, but a structure of that size couldn't be sustained by weapons alone, and El Mayo knew that better than anyone. His true power didn't lie in violence, but in corruption. He didn't need armies or squads of hitmen. A well-locked briefcase was enough. Police officers, soldiers, judges, governors, everyone had a price. And El Mayo knew the exact value of each one. In his world, a bought signature was worth more than 1,000 fired bullets. Every payment was an investment. Every silence, a shield. Money, not weapons, was the backbone of his empire. Meanwhile, his partner Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán chose a completely different path. El Chapo loved risk, fame, and absolute control. While one sank into the shadows, the other became the visible face of the cartel. El Chapo's spectacular escapes, his eccentricities, and his media boldness turned him into a global myth. But that same attention that made him famous was, for El Mayo, a death sentence. From the northern mountains, Zambada watched from a distance, in silence, perfecting the art he had turned into his trademark, disappearing. While the world focused on headlines, El Mayo Zambada built his own financial arm, a money laundering system as discreet as it was efficient. Cattle ranching, agriculture, real estate, legitimate businesses, each was another piece in the invisible machinery that kept the empire of the Ghost of Sinaloa alive. Everything formed part of an invisible network that turned millions of dirty dollars into clean and seemingly respectable fortunes. And the most surprising thing, El Mayo didn't live surrounded by luxury or extravagance. There were no mansions with Italian marble or collections of sports cars, only modest ranches, dirt roads, and a man who preferred to sleep to the sound of crickets, rather than under a gilded roof. There, among ordinary people, he built a community that saw him not as a criminal, but as a benefactor, a man who built schools, provided jobs, and helped his own. That's why no one talked, and that's why no one betrayed him. While other kingpins communicated through satellite phones or encrypted messages, El Mayo remained faithful to the methods of another era. No cell phones, no digital traces, only trusted messengers who traveled on horseback or in old pickup trucks, delivering orders from memory. It was an anachronistic, almost handcrafted strategy, but also one immune to technology and betrayal. There were no intercepted calls, no recordings, no traces. Just one man pulling the strings of power from the shadows. It was said he never slept 2 nights in the same place. That his safety depended not on walls or armed guards, but on the land he knew like the back of his hand. He often slept on a mat, with a rifle beside him and his ear alert to the barking of dogs. The contrast with his partner was absolute. One played at being a legend, the other at not existing. While Guzmán challenged governments, Zambada bought them. While one sought the cameras, the other avoided them at all costs. 2 men, 1 empire, but 2 opposite ways of understanding power. And though no one knew it yet, that perfect balance was about to break. When the world heard about the secret interview with Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, organized by actress Kate del Castillo and actor Sean Penn, El Mayo Zambada didn't need to say a single word. He knew that this gesture, more than an act of vanity, was his partner's final sentence. The man who had made silence his shield had just watched his companion shine too brightly. And in the world of drug trafficking, light always announces the end. The War of Silence. December 2006. Mexico changed forever. The newly elected president, Felipe Calderón Hinojosa, declared open war on drug trafficking. For the first time, the Mexican state no longer spoke of organized crime. It spoke of military enemies. Thousands of soldiers were deployed in the streets. The skies filled with helicopters, the highways became checkpoints, and the border neighborhoods turned into war zones. The war had begun, and the main target was clear: the Sinaloa Cartel. For the first time, the Mexican government directly faced the most powerful criminal organization on the continent. But in that battle, the enemy was different. It wasn't rival cartels or corrupt agents. It was the state itself. The cartel's operations now had to evade not only bribed police, but also the army, a force that didn't accept bribes as easily. Or at least, not all of them. True to his style, El Mayo Zambada didn't respond with violence. While other kingpins declared open war, he doubled down on corruption. For him, war wasn't won by shooting, but by buying the right silences. He bought generals, commanders, politicians. He turned money into an invisible shield. While the streets burned, El Mayo Zambada remained silent, moving through the folds of the system, as present as he was, untouchable. But in the void left by chaos, something worse emerged. An enemy that sought not deals, but destruction. They were Los Zetas, former elite soldiers, deserters trained for war, experts in weapons, torture, and psychological terror. Their message was simple and brutal. No one was safe. Public decapitations, bodies hanging from bridges, massacres on highways. Horror stopped being news. It became routine. Los Zetas were born as the armed wing of the Gulf Cartel, but soon rebelled and formed their own organization. They seized territories, spread fear, and directly challenged Sinaloa. The entire country was sinking into a spiral of violence. And while the Sinaloa Cartel resisted the advance of the Zetas, the first cracks began to open within its own core. The first serious blow to El Mayo's power came in October 2008. In a joint operation between the DEA and Mexican federal forces, his brother, Jesus, El Rey, Zambada, the man in charge of logistics in Mexico City, was captured. He wasn't a hitman. He was the architect of distribution, the mind behind the warehouses, laboratories, and transport routes. His arrest was a direct blow to the cartel's nervous system, an unmistakable sign that the government had learned to strike. Where it hurt the most, the structure, not the strength. But what El Mayo didn't know was that this blow would only mark the beginning of a far more dangerous storm. On the chessboard of drug trafficking, alliances began to crumble, enemies multiplied, and loyalties vanished one by one. For the first time in decades, the ghost of Sinaloa began to feel that his own silence was no longer enough to keep him safe. The betrayal of blood. The year 2008 marked the beginning of a storm that not even the most powerful could stop. For years, the Beltrán Leiva brothers had been the most loyal armed wing of the Sinaloa Cartel. Trusted men, blood allies, guardians of the most dangerous routes. But in January of that year, everything changed. Alfredo Beltrán Leiva, known as El Mojomo, was captured in a surprise operation. For the authorities, it was a strategic blow. For the cartel, it was the beginning of chaos. Arturo Beltrán Leiva, consumed by paranoia, convinced that someone within the cartel had betrayed him, pointed to the worst possible enemy, Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán. The suspicion spread like fire through the jungle. The alliance between the two families, a brotherhood that had lasted more than a decade, was broken in an instant. What had once been a network of partners became an internal war, one of the bloodiest in Mexico's recent history. Ambushes, mass executions, bodies hanging from bridges, border cities turned into battlefields. The Beltrán Leiva brothers, now declared enemies, began eliminating operators loyal to El Chapo and El Mayo. Thousands of lives were lost in that fratricidal war, and for the first time, the Sinaloa Empire began to crack from within. For El Mayo Zambada, that war meant more than the loss of allies. It was the beginning of the end of an era. He was no longer facing the state and Los Zetas alone, but also the very men who had helped him build his kingdom. The most painful blow came a few months later, in March 2009. In a joint operation between federal forces and the DEA, his son and natural heir was captured. Jesus Vicente Zambada Niebla El Vicentillo. He wasn't a hitman. He was the logistical brain of the cartel, responsible for coordinating clandestine flights, international routes, and direct contacts with Colombian emissaries. His capture was more than an operational loss. It was a personal wound. The line of succession of the ghost of Sinaloa had just been cut. For the government, his capture was a trophy. For El Mayo, it was a direct blow to the soul. In 2010, Jesus Vicente Zambada Niebla, El Vicentillo, was extradited to the United States. There, circumstances forced him to make a decision that would mark him forever: to cooperate with U.S. justice. During the trials, his testimony revealed secrets that shook Mexico: political contacts, bribes to officials, and financial operations of the Sinaloa Cartel that reached the highest levels of power. The betrayal did not come from an enemy. but from his own blood. And for a man like El Mayo Zambada, that was a wound that never healed. The empire that had survived governments, wars, and external betrayals was beginning to collapse from within. The country was bleeding out, and the cartel, weakened, survived only thanks to the silence of the man who never appeared. But the world was about to witness another historic event: the fall of the most famous media symbol of modern drug trafficking. February 2014. After years of pursuit, the Mexican Navy and the DEA achieved what had once seemed impossible: the capture of Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, the most wanted drug lord on the planet. The operation was surgical. Marines stormed a luxury condominium in Mazatlán, Sinaloa, and caught him while he slept. There were no shots fired. There was no resistance. Only the end of an era. The man who had built an empire with audacity and noise was defeated by discretion, and the one who had never stepped out of the shadows remained free, patient, waiting for his turn in history. The last free man. There was no gunfight. There was no chase. The man who had escaped from Puente Grande prison a decade earlier was captured without a single shot fired. Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, the most feared and publicized face of drug trafficking, had fallen once again. For the government, it was a historic victory. Images of El Chapo in handcuffs, surrounded by masked Marines, circulated around the world as a symbol of delayed but relentless justice. The press celebrated it as the end of an era. However, behind the cameras, the true power of the Sinaloa Cartel remained intact. While the country celebrated, El Mayo Zambada kept pulling the strings in silence. The routes didn't stop, the operations didn't collapse, and the money kept flowing as if nothing had happened. The capo who never appeared once again proved his golden rule. Real power isn't displayed, it's exercised. But history still had a surprise in store. Barely a year after his capture, on the 11th of July 2015, El Chapo did the impossible once again. That night, a tunnel more than 1.5 kilometers long was dug right beneath his cell. In the maximum security prison of El Altiplano, the passage had ventilation, lighting, and a motorcycle mounted on rails. To cross it in a matter of minutes. The escape became a global humiliation for the Mexican government, and the ultimate proof of what everyone already suspected. The Sinaloa Cartel not only survived, it continued to infiltrate the highest institutions of the state. The scandal crossed borders, and this time, the United States did not forgive. Washington pressured the Mexican government like never before, demanding results, arrests, and extraditions. The myth of El Chapo Guzmán had already surpassed his own empire. And for both countries, it was no longer an issue of drug trafficking. It was a matter of political credibility. After 6 months of pursuit, on the 8th of January 2016, Mexican special forces surrounded a house in Los Mochis, Sinaloa. The operation was swift, surgical, and flawless. And once again, the world's most wanted fugitive was captured. But this time there would be no tunnels, no rescues, no bribes. Mexico could no longer afford to be the laughingstock of the world. In January 2017, Joaquín Guzmán Loera was extradited to the United States. There he faced a historic trial in New York, where secrets were revealed that shook the world. Alliances with politicians, bribes to officials, and the true extent of the Sinaloa Cartel's power. The verdict was decisive: life imprisonment. Today, the man who was once the symbol of global drug trafficking remains confined under total isolation in the maximum security prison ADX Florence in Colorado. While the entire world watched El Chapo behind bars, another man remained free. No cameras, no headlines, never having spent a single day in prison. Ismael El Mayo Zambada, the ghost of drug trafficking, had outlived them all. And though his face remained a mystery, his shadow still covered everything. The last ghost. The irony of power is that it always ends up consuming the one who chases it. While Joaquín Guzmán Loera was buried behind the walls of a U.S. maximum security prison, Ismael El Mayo Zambada remained free, invisible, untouchable, the only kingpin of his generation who had never spent a single night in a cell. For more than 5 decades, he pulled the strings of drug trafficking from the shadows with the precision of a watchmaker who is never seen. But even ghosts, when time catches up with them, begin to lose their shape. The net was closing in slowly and silently. The Mexican government, under constant pressure from Washington, had turned his capture into a diplomatic obsession. A $15 million reward was offered for his head, one of the highest in the history of drug trafficking. He was no longer just a name on the most wanted list. He was the #1 target of 2 nations. Time, however, was collecting its own toll. At over 70 years old and in declining health, El Mayo Zambada faced enemies more dangerous than the DEA or the army: old age and generational betrayal. In the void left by El Chapo, a new generation was claiming the throne. They were his sons, Los Chapitos, young, impulsive, unpredictable, ambitious men who shared neither the rules of silence nor the discipline of the old order. For them, the business was not a tradition, it was a show, and their war for control of the cartel became inevitable. The empire began to fragment. The roots, the contacts, the loyalties, everything started to crack. The Sinaloa Cartel, once a perfect machine, split into rival factions, while the ghost who had once united them watched helplessly from afar. Isolated in the mountains of the Golden Triangle, El Mayo Zambada had become a king without a kingdom. The man who had survived them all: governments, betrayals, wars, and enemies. Lethal. He now watched as his own empire slowly bled out. For more than half a century, he had outwitted justice, cheated death, and manipulated power with almost supernatural skill. But the enemy that finally reached him wore no uniform and carried no badge. It was betrayal. No one could have imagined that the end of the ghost of Sinaloa would not come with a raid or a gunfight, but with a handshake and a lie. The betrayal of the century. After more than 5 decades evading the law, Ismael El Mayo Zambada didn't fall to the state's bullets or an intelligence operation. He fell to something far more devastating: the betrayal of his own family. By 2024, the tension inside the Sinaloa Cartel had reached a point of no return. Los Chapitos, the sons of Joaquín Guzmán Loera, had taken control of the fentanyl trade, the most profitable and also the most closely watched drug on the planet. The money was immeasurable, but so was the pressure. From Washington, the U.S. government demanded results. Captured kingpins, destroyed labs, surrendered names, and at the top of every blacklist was the same name as always: Ismael Zambada Garcia, El Mayo. American pressure put Los Chapitos in an impossible position. They knew that sooner or later, someone would have to pay the price. And to preserve their empire, they made the coldest, most calculated decision of their lives: to sacrifice the man who had founded it. According to later statements by El Mayo Zambada himself, the plan was devised by Joaquín Guzmán López, one of El Chapo's sons. On the 25th of July 2024, El Mayo was summoned to a private meeting at the Huertos del Pedregal Ranch, an elegant event venue on the outskirts of Culiacán. The pretext seemed legitimate: a meeting with political figures from Sinaloa, Governor Rubén Rocha Moya, and former Rector Héctor Melecio Cuen Ojeda, to discuss disputes involving the Autonomous University of Sinaloa. They even assured him that Iván Guzmán Salazar, another of Los Chapitos, would be present. El Mayo arrived accompanied by 4 bodyguards. 2 stayed to guard the perimeter, and 2 went inside with him. Among them was an old ally, José Rosario Eras López, commander of the Sinaloa Judicial Police. The atmosphere was tense, different. Too many armed men, too many evasive looks. Even so, El Mayo advanced. He still believed loyalty existed. Joaquín Guzmán López greeted him with a smile and a gesture. "Come in, they're waiting for us inside." They entered a dimly lit room. The air was heavy. And then, everything changed. A group of men burst in from behind. They knocked him down, put a hood over his head, and tied his hands and feet. The man who had survived 5 decades of manhunts was subdued without a single shot fired. During the trip, they beat him, dragged him into a truck, and took him to a private airstrip. There, they put him aboard a private plane. He was hooded, bound hand and foot, not knowing who was flying, not knowing where they were taking him. In the seat across from him, according to his own testimony, Joaquín Guzmán López watched him in silence. 2 hours later, the ghost of Sinaloa had crossed the border, and for the first time in his life, Ismael Zambada Garcia was in U.S. custody. The end of silence. Inside the aircraft, Joaquín Guzmán López removed the hood. In front of him sat the tired face of a man who had defied the world for half a century. There were no bodyguards, no gunmen, no witnesses, only the pilot, the traitor, and silence. For 2.5 hours, the plane crossed Mexican airspace heading north. When it landed in El Paso, Texas, the myth crumbled. Ismael El Mayo Zambada Garcia, the man who had outsmarted everyone, was finally in U.S. custody. There were no gunshots, no glory, only the metallic sound of handcuffs closing for the first time. After more than 5 decades in the shadows, the ghost of Sinaloa had a face, a prisoner number, and a fate he could no longer control. His story ends far from the mountains where he was born, far from the ranches where he was revered as a benefactor, far from the shadows where he built his legend. The last great kingpin of the old school has fallen, but his capture brought neither peace nor justice, only a new power vacuum. And in the world of drug trafficking, vacuums never stay empty for long. The empire El Mayo helped build still stands, divided among new hands, among sons, enemies, and ghosts. Today, as Zambada awaits his end behind walls of steel, the business he built with discretion and blood keeps turning, relentless, as if nothing had changed. And though his story seems to have reached its conclusion, one question still echoes. Is it worth living surrounded by power and money, if in the end you can't even trust your own shadow? Thank you for joining us until the end of this story. If you enjoyed this documentary, subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps us more than you can imagine, to keep telling the real stories the world tries to forget. See you in the next episode of Mafia Story.